Losing your wife is painful, but discovering she chose your best friend can make you question every memory you ever trusted. The day my marriage ended started like any other Tuesday. I left work a little earlier than usual because a meeting had been canceled, and for the first time in weeks, I was looking forward to getting home. Sophia had mentioned making dinner that night, and I remember thinking it would be nice to spend a quiet evening together. Life had been busy lately. Work, deadlines, bills, responsibilities, all the ordinary things that slowly consume your attention. As I pulled into the driveway of our suburban home, nothing seemed unusual. Sophia's car was there. The porch light was on even though the sun had not fully set. Everything looked normal. Looking back now, I think that is what hurt the most. Disaster rarely announces itself. It waits behind ordinary moments. I walked through the front door and immediately sensed something was different. The house felt strangely tense. Not loud, not chaotic, just tense. Sophia was sitting in the living room. Across from her sat Grant Walker, my best friend of more than 20 years. Grant and I had met in college. He had stood beside me at my wedding. We had celebrated promotions together, watched football games together, and helped each other through some of life's toughest moments. If someone had asked me that morning to name the two people I trusted most in the world, I would have said Sophia and Grant without hesitation. Neither of them smiled when I entered the room. Grant looked uncomfortable. Sophia looked determined. My stomach tightened immediately. I set my briefcase down near the door and asked what was going on. For a few seconds, nobody answered. Then Sophia took a deep breath and said words that completely changed my life. "Lucas, I am with Grant now." At first, I thought I misunderstood her. My brain searched desperately for another meaning. Maybe she was talking about a business project. Maybe a trip. Maybe anything else. But the silence that followed told me exactly what she meant. I looked at Grant, hoping he would deny it. Hoping he would laugh and tell me this was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he lowered his eyes toward the floor. That was all the confirmation I needed. The room suddenly felt smaller. My heart pounded so loudly that I could barely hear my own thoughts. Years of friendship and marriage seemed to collapse into a single moment. Then Sophia delivered the sentence I still remember word for word. "Move out if you cannot handle it." There was no hesitation in her voice. No apology. No regret. Just certainty. I stared at both of them, waiting for someone to explain how we had arrived here. Nobody did. The woman I had spent nearly 15 years loving sat beside the man I considered a brother, and together they looked at me as though I were the outsider. Standing there in my own home, I realized something terrifying. The betrayal was not new. The truth had simply arrived before I was ready to see it. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument I had ever experienced. I looked at Grant and searched for some trace of the friend I thought I knew. We had spent more than 2 decades sharing milestones, challenges, and memories. He knew things about me that almost nobody else knew. Yet sitting there beside my wife, he looked like a stranger. Finally, he cleared his throat and said my name. "Lucas." That was as far as he got. I raised my hand and stopped him. I did not want excuses. I did not want explanations. Not yet. Nothing he could say would change what I was seeing with my own eyes. Sophia sat quietly, watching me. Her expression was not cruel. If anything, it seemed strangely detached, as though she had already processed everything weeks or months ago and was simply waiting for me to catch up. That realization hurt more than I expected. While my world was collapsing in real time, hers had apparently moved on long ago. I took a slow breath and looked around the living room. Family photographs decorated the shelves. Vacation pictures lined the walls. A framed photo from our 10th wedding anniversary sat near the fireplace. Everywhere I looked, I saw pieces of a life I believed was real. Suddenly, every memory felt uncertain. How long had this been happening? When had the friendship ended? When had the marriage ended? Had either of them planned to tell me? Or had I simply arrived home earlier than expected? Questions flooded my mind, but answers seemed impossible to trust. "How long?" I finally asked. Sophia exchanged a glance with Grant. Neither seemed eager to respond. That hesitation told me enough. Whatever the truth was, neither of them wanted to say it aloud. "Long enough," Sophia replied quietly. The words landed harder than I expected. Long enough. Not weeks. Not days. Long enough. I nodded slowly. Oddly, the anger I expected never arrived. Instead, I felt exhausted. Completely exhausted. It was the kind of exhaustion that comes when something you have carried for years suddenly falls away. Looking back, maybe part of me already knew something was wrong. Maybe I had ignored signs because the alternative felt too painful to accept. I remembered recent months when Sophia seemed increasingly distant. I remembered weekends when Grant canceled plans at the last minute. I remembered moments that felt strange, but never strange enough to confront. One by one, those memories returned and formed a picture I could no longer ignore. Grant stood up from the couch. "Lucas, I never wanted this to happen like this." I almost laughed at the absurdity of the statement. As though there was a better version of this conversation. As though betrayal came with an ideal delivery method. Instead, I simply picked up my briefcase. Sophia looked surprised. "Where are you going?" she asked. I looked at both of them for a moment before answering. "I need time to think." Then I walked toward the front door. Behind me, neither of them tried to stop me. And as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized that the hardest part was not losing my wife or my best friend. The hardest part was accepting that the people I trusted most had already left long before I opened that front door. I spent that night in a small hotel about 15 minutes from the house. Sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, another memory surfaced. Grant sitting beside me at my wedding reception. Grant helping me move into my first home. Grant standing next to me after my father passed away. The memories arrived one after another, each one making the betrayal feel more difficult to understand. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and sat by the window watching traffic move through the empty streets below. That was when something unexpected happened. Instead of focusing on what I had just discovered, I started remembering things I had ignored. Small moments. Strange moments. Moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A business conference 6 months earlier came to mind. Sophia had insisted on joining me even though she normally avoided work-related travel. During the trip, I remembered catching her texting repeatedly while we were having dinner. When I asked who she was talking to, she casually said it was a friend from college. At the time, I accepted the answer without question. Now I was not so sure. Then I remembered a football game Grant and I attended the previous fall. Halfway through the event, he stepped away to take a phone call. When he returned, he seemed distracted for the rest of the evening. I never asked why. I trusted him completely. Looking back, trust had made me blind. By sunrise, dozens of forgotten moments had resurfaced. None of them proved anything on their own, but together they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. The signs had been there. I simply never wanted to see them. The following day, I went to work anyway. Sitting alone in a hotel room would only make things worse. As I walked through the office, I did my best to act normal. Most people never noticed anything unusual. A few coworkers commented that I looked tired. I blamed it on a long night and kept moving. Around noon, Megan Foster stopped by my office. Megan had worked with me for years and possessed the rare ability to notice things other people missed. She studied me carefully before sitting down. "Something is wrong," she said. It was not a question. I considered denying it, but quickly realized there was no point. "You could say that." Megan nodded slowly. "Do you want to talk about it?" I appreciated the offer, but I was not ready. "Not yet. Maybe someday," I replied. She respected the answer and changed the subject. After she left, I found myself staring at my computer screen without reading a single word. My mind kept returning to the same question. How long had Sophia and Grant been building a different future while I was still investing in the one we shared? That evening, I returned to the hotel and received a message from Sophia. It was short. She wanted to talk. No apology. No explanation. Just 3 words asking for a conversation. I stared at the message for several minutes before setting the phone down. For the first time in my life, I did not know what I wanted to hear from her. Because deep down, I was beginning to understand a painful truth. The real damage had not happened the day I walked into that living room. The real damage had happened gradually, one hidden choice at a time, while I continued believing the people closest to me would never betray my trust. The next evening, I finally agreed to meet Sophia. Not because I wanted answers anymore, but because avoiding the conversation would not change reality. We met at a quiet coffee shop a few miles from the house. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting alone near the window. For a moment, she looked exactly like the woman I married 15 years earlier. Then I remembered why we were meeting. Sophia stood as I approached. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. I nodded and took a seat across from her. Neither of us touched the drinks sitting on the table. The silence stretched between us before she finally spoke. I know you are angry. The strange thing was that I was not. At least not in the way she expected. Anger requires energy. By that point, I felt mostly disappointment. I am trying to understand, I replied. Sophia lowered her eyes. Grant, and I did not plan for this to happen. That sentence sounded familiar. It was exactly the kind of explanation people offer when they know the truth sounds worse. I listened quietly as she talked. She described feeling disconnected. She described loneliness. She described months of confusion. Some of what she said may have been true. Relationships are complicated. Marriages experience difficult seasons. But as I listened, I noticed something missing. Accountability. Every explanation seemed to focus on circumstances rather than choices. Eventually, I asked the question that mattered most. Did you ever intend to tell me before I found out? Sophia hesitated. That pause answered everything. She looked away and quietly admitted she did not know. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. Cars moved through the parking lot. People walked by carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Ordinary lives continued while mine felt completely different. Lucas, she said carefully, I never wanted to hurt you. I believed her. Most people do not wake up hoping to hurt someone they once loved. But intentions and actions are not the same thing. You still did, I replied. Tears formed in her eyes, but I remained calm. For the first time since discovering the truth, something inside me became clear. I was no longer interested in convincing anyone to choose me. If someone needed to compare me to another person, I had already lost something far more important than a relationship. I had lost their respect. The conversation continued for another hour. Sophia apologized several times. She admitted mistakes. She admitted regrets. Yet every word only reinforced a realization that had been growing since I left the house. The marriage I was mourning no longer existed. Maybe it had not existed for a long time. When we finally stood to leave, Sophia looked at me with sadness. What happens now? She asked. I thought about the house, the marriage, the friendship, the future I once imagined. Then I gave the only honest answer I had. Now I moved forward. As I walked toward my car, I felt something unexpected. Not happiness, not relief, freedom. For the first time since entering that living room, I stopped focusing on what I had lost and started thinking about what kind of life I wanted to build next. The weeks that followed were some of the most difficult and most important of my life. At first, every morning felt unfamiliar. I had moved into a modest apartment across town, and the silence was something I had to learn to live with. For years, my routines revolved around other people. Now, for the first time in a very long time, I had to figure out who I was without the roles of husband and best friend defining my identity. The adjustment was not easy. Some evenings felt longer than others. Some memories arrived without warning. A restaurant we used to visit. A song playing in a grocery store. A photograph appearing unexpectedly on social media. Yet something surprising happened as the days turned into weeks. The pain stopped controlling every thought. Little by little, I began reclaiming parts of myself I had neglected. I started going to the gym before work. At first, it was simply a way to stay busy. Soon it became something more. The discipline helped clear my mind. The routine gave structure to my days. I also began spending more time with family members I had unintentionally drifted away from over the years. Conversations became easier. Laughter returned more often than I expected. At work, my focus improved dramatically. Instead of carrying constant emotional stress into every meeting, I found myself fully present. Robert Hayes noticed the change almost immediately. One afternoon, he called me into his office and complimented my leadership on a major project. He told me that several executives had specifically mentioned my performance. Under normal circumstances, I would have appreciated the praise and moved on. This time felt different. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel proud. Not because of recognition, because I had earned it. Megan also noticed the changes. During lunch one afternoon, she smiled and said I seemed lighter. The word stayed with me. Lighter. She was right. I still carried sadness, but I was no longer carrying confusion. The betrayal had given me painful clarity. I finally understood that loyalty, respect, and trust could never survive where they were not equally valued. Around 2 months after leaving the house, I received an unexpected message from an old friend inviting me to join a weekend hiking group. Normally, I would have declined. Instead, I said yes. That single decision led to more invitations, new friendships, and experiences I would have missed if I had remained trapped inside my old life. Slowly, my world expanded again. Meanwhile, I heard occasional updates about Sophia and Grant through mutual acquaintances. I never asked for information, but small communities have a way of sharing news. Apparently, they were now openly together. Hearing that should have upset me. Instead, I felt surprisingly indifferent. Their choices no longer defined my future. One evening, after returning from the gym, I caught my reflection in a mirror near the apartment entrance. For a moment, I barely recognized the man looking back. Not because he looked dramatically different, because he stood differently. The defeated husband who walked out of his own house that night was slowly disappearing. In his place was someone stronger, calmer, and more confident. For the first time since everything fell apart, I realized I was not rebuilding my old life. I was building a better one. About 6 months after I left the house, I stopped measuring time by what happened between Sophia and me. That realization alone felt like a victory. There had been a period when every thought somehow led back to the betrayal. Every memory carried questions. Every quiet moment invited old pain to return. But eventually, life moved forward. Not because I forced it to, because that is what life does when you stop living inside the past. Work continued improving. The project I had helped lead exceeded expectations, and Robert Hayes surprised me with an opportunity to oversee an even larger division. The promotion came with more responsibility, but it also came with something I valued far more than a title: respect. People trusted my judgment. They sought my advice. They included me in conversations that shaped important decisions. For years, I had underestimated how much confidence grows when you surround yourself with people who genuinely appreciate your contributions. Outside of work, my social life expanded in ways I never expected. The hiking group I joined became a regular part of my weekends. New friendships developed naturally. There was no pressure to impress anyone. No need to explain my past. I could simply be myself. One Saturday afternoon, while sharing lunch with a group after a trail walk, someone asked what had changed in my life over the past year. I thought about the question for a moment before answering. I finally stopped trying to convince people to value me. The table grew quiet for a second. Then several people nodded as though they understood exactly what I meant. Around the same time, occasional updates about Sophia and Grant continued reaching me through mutual acquaintances. I never encouraged those conversations, but information has a way of finding its path. What I heard surprised me. The relationship that seemed so certain on the day I walked into my living room was no longer going as smoothly as expected. Apparently, disagreements had become common. Friends noticed tension. Social gatherings that once included both of them became increasingly rare. Hearing those things did not make me happy. If anything, it reinforced a lesson I had already learned. Relationships built on excitement often struggle when ordinary reality arrives. One evening, Megan and I stayed late reviewing a presentation for an upcoming executive meeting. As we packed our materials, she smiled and said something that stayed with me. "You know, Lucas, you seem like a completely different person from the one who walked into this office 6 months ago." I laughed softly. "Hopefully a better version." She nodded. "Definitely a stronger one." Driving home that night, I thought about her words. Strength was not what I felt when I first left the house. Back then, I felt broken, lost, humiliated. Yet those experiences forced me to rebuild from a more honest foundation. I no longer needed validation from a spouse, a friend, or anyone else. My worth did not depend on being chosen. It existed independently. As I parked outside my apartment, I looked up at the city lights reflecting against the night sky and felt genuine peace. Not because everything had worked out exactly as planned. Because I finally understood that losing the wrong people sometimes creates space for the right version of yourself to emerge. What I did not know then was that the next chapter of this story was about to begin, and this time, Sophia would be the one reaching out. 3 weeks after hearing that Sophia and Grant were struggling, I received a message from a number I almost deleted without reading. It was Sophia. The message was simple. She asked if we could talk. No emergency. No complicated explanation. Just a request for a conversation. I stared at the screen for several seconds before setting my phone aside. A year earlier, a message from her would have affected my entire day. Now it felt different. Not because I hated her. Because my life no longer revolved around her choices. 2 days later, curiosity convinced me to respond. We agreed to meet at a small cafe near a public park on a Saturday afternoon. When I arrived, Sophia was already there. The first thing I noticed was how different she seemed. Not physically, emotionally. The confidence she carried on the day I walked into that living room was gone. In its place was someone quieter, more reflective. She stood when she saw me and offered a nervous smile. "Thank you for meeting me." I nodded politely and sat down. For a few minutes, we exchanged ordinary conversation. Work, family, life. Eventually, the small talk disappeared. Sophia looked down at her coffee cup before speaking. "Grant and I are no longer together." The announcement did not surprise me. Based on what I had heard, I suspected that outcome was coming. Still, I simply listened. Sophia explained that reality had been very different from expectations. The excitement that once made everything seem certain gradually faded. Everyday life arrived. Differences became impossible to ignore. Arguments became more common. Eventually, they both realized they were building something on a foundation that was never stable. As she talked, I noticed something important. For the first time, she was not blaming circumstances. She was taking responsibility. "I made a terrible mistake, Lucas," she said quietly. "The worst mistake of my life." I remained silent. Not because I disagreed. Because there was nothing useful to add. Sophia continued speaking. She told me she had spent months thinking about the choices that led to the collapse of our marriage. She admitted she had taken my loyalty for granted. She admitted she assumed I would always be there regardless of how she treated me. Hearing those words felt strange. They were things I had wanted her to understand years earlier. Yet now that she finally understood them, they no longer carried the same power. The man sitting across from her was no longer waiting for validation. Before leaving, Sophia looked directly at me and asked a question I had been expecting since the conversation began. "Do you think people can change?" I thought carefully before answering. "Yes," I said honestly. Relief appeared on her face for a brief second. Then I continued. "But change does not erase consequences." The expression that followed told me she understood exactly what I meant. As we stood and prepared to leave, she thanked me again for meeting her. This time her gratitude sounded genuine. Walking back toward my car, I felt neither triumph nor bitterness. Just clarity. Sophia was finally seeing the value she once overlooked. The difference was that I had already learned it myself. And when someone discovers their own worth, they stop depending on other people to define it. Over the next several months, Sophia continued reaching out occasionally. The messages were never aggressive or demanding. Most were simple check-ins asking how I was doing or wishing me well on holidays and birthdays. Sometimes I responded. Sometimes I did not. There was no anger behind my decisions. I simply answered when it felt natural. During that period, something unexpected happened. The more distance I gained from the past, the more clearly I could see it. I began recognizing how much of my old identity had been tied to being needed by other people. For years, I measured success through sacrifice. I believed being a good husband meant constantly putting myself last. The betrayal forced me to challenge that belief. It taught me that healthy relationships require mutual respect, not endless self-abandonment. One afternoon, nearly 18 months after I left the house, Sophia asked if we could meet again. This time, I agreed without hesitation. We met at a quiet restaurant overlooking a river on the edge of town. The atmosphere felt relaxed, comfortable. Neither of us seemed nervous anymore. We spent almost an hour talking about ordinary things. Family updates, career changes, mutual acquaintances. It was surprisingly pleasant. Eventually, Sophia became quiet. She stared out the window for several seconds before turning back toward me. "There is something I need to say." I already knew where the conversation was heading. "Okay," I replied. She took a deep breath. "I have spent a long time thinking about everything that happened." Her voice remained steady, but emotion lingered beneath every word. The more distance I get, the more I realize what I threw away. I listened without interruption. Sophia continued. She talked about trust, loyalty, stability. She admitted that she spent years focusing on what she thought was missing instead of appreciating what was already there. Then she said something that surprised me. "I do not think I ever understood how much you loved me until I no longer had it." The honesty in her voice was impossible to ignore. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she finally asked the question that had been building since the day we met again at the cafe months earlier. "Do you think there is any chance for us?" The question hung between us. Not because I needed time to decide, because I wanted to answer with complete honesty. I looked across the table at someone I had once planned to spend the rest of my life with. I saw regret, sincerity, growth. Sophia had changed. I truly believed that. But I had changed too. That was the part she still struggled to understand. The version of me who would have done anything to save our marriage no longer existed. Life had moved forward. So had I. You deserve honesty, I said quietly. And the truth is that I wish good things for you. I really do. Sophia nodded slowly. She already knew what was coming. But wishing you happiness and rebuilding our marriage are not the same thing. Her eyes filled with sadness, yet she did not look away. For the first time, there were no arguments. No excuses. No misunderstandings. Just acceptance. As the afternoon sunlight reflected across the river outside, I realized we were finally having the conversation we should have had years ago, when truth still had the power to change the ending. After our conversation by the river, Sophia and I remained seated for a few more minutes. Neither of us seemed eager to leave, not because there was more to say, but because we both understood that something important had just ended. For years, our story had been defined by unanswered questions, hurt feelings, and unfinished conversations. Now, for the first time, there was clarity. Sophia looked at me with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. I wish I had understood sooner, she said quietly. I nodded. I know. There was no anger in my voice. No satisfaction either. One of the biggest surprises of my journey was discovering that healing does not create a desire for revenge. Real healing creates peace. As we stood and prepared to leave, Sophia thanked me for listening. Then she said something I will never forget. You became the man I always needed, and I realized it only after I stopped being the woman you deserved. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I smiled gently and wished her well. We walked in opposite directions, and this time neither of us looked back. The drive home felt strangely peaceful, not because everything had worked out the way I once hoped, because I finally accepted that some chapters are meant to end. Over the following months, life continued moving forward. Work remained fulfilling. Friendships continued growing. New opportunities appeared. More importantly, I no longer viewed my past as a tragedy. I viewed it as an education. The betrayal that once felt like the worst thing that ever happened to me ultimately forced me to become stronger, wiser, and more confident than I had ever been before. Looking back now, I understand something that took years to learn. The people who truly value you never require you to prove your worth repeatedly. Respect should not be negotiated. Loyalty should not be one-sided. And love should never require you to abandon yourself in order to keep someone else happy. Grant taught me that friendship without integrity is fragile. Sophia taught me that affection without appreciation eventually disappears. But most importantly, the entire experience taught me that self-respect is the foundation of every healthy relationship. When you know your value, you stop begging people to recognize it. You simply walk away from those who refuse to see it. Years earlier, being told to leave my own home felt like the end of everything. Today, I see it differently. That painful evening was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a better one. Sometimes losing the people you trust most reveals the strength you never knew you possessed. Sometimes rejection becomes redirection. And sometimes the greatest gift hidden inside heartbreak is the opportunity to finally discover who you are without anyone else's approval. As I finish telling this story, I am curious about your perspective. If you were in Lucas's position, would you have given Sophia another chance after everything that happened? Or do you believe some decisions permanently change a relationship? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoy stories about personal growth, resilience, relationships, and the lessons hidden inside life's most difficult moments, consider subscribing so you can join us for more unforgettable journeys like this one.